In recent weeks, there has been much discussion of the inflationary effect of Trump tariffs. And this has been generated by Donald J. Trump talking about a revenue tariff of 10%. It's interesting that the 10% revenue tariff discussion actually began in his first term. At that time, it was thought that they might need to have extra revenue to pass the Trump tax cuts that were passed in the first term. The problem in passing these kind of bills in the US is that it's only easy to pass them, or it's only really possible to pass them, if they're passed as reconciliation bills. And that is to say, a reconciliation bill is a bill in which there is no effect upon the budget balance. And if you have no effect upon the budget balance of a finance bill, then you only need a simple majority of the US Senate to pass it. If, on the other hand, you have a finance bill which increases the budget deficit, then you need to have a majority of 60 votes in the US Senate to pass it. So that means that they're very, very difficult to pass, those kind of bills. And so the process of reconciliation. But what they found was in the first Trump tariff cuts is that they could reduce some dividends or some tax cuts for particular states and therefore pass the overall tax bill in a way which didn't affect the budget balance. And so as a result of that, important tax cuts for individuals and as well as individuals, a major corporate tax cut, bringing the US corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%, was able to be passed. We've come to the point where Trump needs to reduce corporate taxes and other taxes again, but now he needs an additional source of funding for in order to balance this bill to make it a reconciliation bill. That is to say, he only needs 51 votes in the Senate to pass the bill. And hence he needs additional sources of income. Now, in a place like the European Union, this would be really simple because you just put up value-added tax. Value-added tax in the Euro area is already running at an average rate of 21.6%. And that's what makes the welfare state in Europe possible. But it's actually almost impossible within the US Constitution to pass a value-added tax. You'd have to get every state to agree, so it's just not going to happen. And so we've got the idea, even in the first Trump term, was discussed, the idea of having a 10% revenue tariff, but they found that it wasn't necessary. Okay, moving forward to this term, and Trump wants to cut corporate taxes again. This time he wants to cut corporate taxes down from 21% to 15%, equal to the German corporate tax rate. And to do that, he really does need additional revenue. And so we get to the idea of the discussion of a 10% revenue tariff. There has been a great deal of talk, particularly within the Democratic Party leading up to the election, with the idea that this would be extremely inflationary and therefore it was a really bad thing because prices would go up further. So it was very interesting, therefore, when the question was put to Trump's candidate for Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, in the recent period of confirmation hearings. And Scott Bessent, who was a hedge fund manager and really has this brilliant record in particularly currency trading, answered quoting what was called optimal tariff theory. In an optimal tariff theory, what you find is that if a country like the United States has a really big market share in imports, then if it puts up its tariffs, then what that does is it pushes up its exchange rate. And so Scott Pessett said a 10% revenue tariff would increase the exchange rate of the US dollar by 4%. Now, what that meant was that the maximum inflationary effect that you could get from a 10% revenue tariff was if you imported 100% of everything into the United States, that would put up inflation by 6%. But if you look at the most recent full-year figures, which are 2023, what you find is only 13% of domestic goods are actually imported into the US. So the maximum inflationary effect that you can get would be 6% multiplied by 0.13, and that gives you 0.8 of 1% increase in the CPI would be the maximum increase that you could get from the CPI. So the effect of the 10% revenue tariffs is effectively inflation neutral. So this whole controversy about the tariff being inflationary, really it's a bust, because it's the amount of inflation is generally negative. At the American Economics Association convention at the beginning of January this year, there was a panel of 4 very distinguished economists. Jason Furman, who was previously on the Council of Economic Advisors of the Democratic Party, Christy Romer, who was in a similar position, Ben Bernanke, who we recall was a long-time chair of the Fed, and John Cochrane, who was a senior fellow of Stanford, of the Hoover Institution in Stanford. They debated this, amongst other questions, this question of whether this tariff was inflationary. And what John Cochrane in particular said, that if you went back and look at the previous periods where there was some major increases in tariffs, that is to say the 1880s and the 1890s, and again in the 1930s, in both cases, prices actually fell slightly rather than went up during those periods when tariffs went up. And the reason was that monetary policy was tight. So John Cochrane, in summing up, said that whether or not it was inflationary would entirely depend upon the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve was accommodative, then it would be inflationary. If the Fed ran a firm hand on monetary policy, then there would be no inflation at all. So where we could get to is there is really no inflationary effect from a revenue tariff in practice. So what Trump now wants to do is he wants to pass one big, beautiful bill, which includes the Reciprocal Trade Act that we talked about last year, in which Trump has the power to negotiate other people's tariffs down to the US level if he wishes, or by threatening to put up American rates up to foreign rates, to match the other country. That he can put that in the bill. He can put the corporate tax cuts down to 15%. Corporate tax cut down to 15% in the bill, and talking about this, Peter Navarro, interviewed on CNBC on the 21st of January, said that if the Trump tax cuts that were enacted previously, if they expired, there would be a $400 billion increase in taxes in the US, and that would generate a recession. But if you have the 10% tariff, Peter Navarro estimated that would raise between $350 and $400 million. So that would say it would make all of these other tax cuts in the bill possible. And so, as he said, you see the beauty of that in the negotiations. So in putting the bill together and negotiating with what they have is a regulatory person in the US Congress called a parliamentarian. But this is actually a bill which doesn't increase the budget deficit, they can pass all of this legislation as a reconciliation bill, and which means, and the Republican Party has more than enough seats in the Senate to generate a majority to pass this legislation and pass these corporate tax and other tax cuts by the end of April. So that's what we have to see occur. But what we have already been able to establish, that the effect of the revenue tariff is 0.8 of 1%, only 0.8 of 1% effect on US prices, and that can easily be eliminated by a moderately tight monetary policy by the Federal Reserve.